This to me reads like a pretty damning report of the PACE program. And not mincing words here, there's text saying that PACE is preying on California's most vulnerable, it facilitates outright contractor fraud, and lacks adequate consumer protection. Can you comment on the severity of this language?
Yeah, the tone is strong, but the report also has more than 100 footnotes. Every word, every adjective is substantiated by the data we reviewed. And the data was a combination of publicly available reports and documents, information that law schools have gotten through public records requests to regulators for data about the internal operation of the PACE program, and most important, our in-depth discussions with legal services providers who serve these PACE program victims and were able to share their stories with their clients' permission.
I mean, this reads to me like this is an ongoing issue and that change needs to happen imminently. Would you say that's correct?
Yes, change needs to happen a long time ago. There has been reform in the PACE program in the last decade. There have been sequential reforms in the state legislature to address some of the really well-documented abuses, but those have been partial and they haven't been adequate. Even the most recent reforms, which occurred about 3 years ago and were heralded by the PACE administrators as solving any industry problems to the extent they even acknowledged those existed, have not been sufficient. And what was interesting and disturbing to us in doing this research was how many so-called PACE originations, in other words, new PACE contracts that have been characterized by fraud and financial abuse were entered into after the most recent reform legislation took effect in 2018. So there is an ongoing problem. It's systemic. It's not one or two bad contractors. It is a program design problem.
And I think that's something too that I wanted to ask about potentially later in the interview, but let's go to it now, which is I've reached out to Y Green, one of the facilitators of the PACE program, and sort of candidly, casually over the phone, they're mulling over whether they'll go on the record with us and speak to us, but they did tell me in so many words that the 2017 legislation has solved these problems and that they take issue with any media reports that indicate that there is an ongoing problem because they would say that this legislation has cured it. So what's your response to that?
My response to that is if you speak to the multiple legal services providers who are credited in the front of our report, those are organizations that handle not one, not 10, dozens to literally over 100 PACE victim cases, many of those arising after the effective date of the most recent reforms. And we also know that the reforms are inadequate because the type of fraud and abuse that's continuing to occur. We just understand that contractors have not fundamentally reformed their practices. And those practices include door-to-door sales as the primary means of reaching low-income residents of color, often monolingual Spanish speakers, often retired, sometimes on benefits. Door-to-door sales are, as we all know, very high pressure, very coercive. And one of the most damning pieces of data we got, and this was looking at information obtained through public records laws, is that once the consumer protection provision kicked in that gave consumers the right to cancel a PACE contract after a few days of thinking about it, many consumers availed themselves of that option. And so looking backwards, that tells us that the high-pressure sales pitch is encouraging people to enter contracts that are really damaging.
And let's go backwards too to sort of how this came to your group at Berkeley. When did this become something that you decided that this needs to be looked at more seriously? How did that happen?
You know, before I came to UC Berkeley, I spent many years as an environmental enforcer at the California Attorney General's office. And I was there during the time that the PACE program was conceived and birthed in the city of Berkeley, which has a well-deserved reputation as an environmental innovator. I mean, we're the city that brought the nation curbside recycling. I'm incredibly proud of that legacy. And I was not only excited about the advent of PACE financing as a way to scale up the climate interventions we desperately need, I knew people, scientists and lawyers who were involved in designing the program and defending it in court in various ways and in political space. So I was an enormous fan of the concept of this creative financing vehicle. And what PACE does that's so smart and needed is it deals with the upfront cost of things that pay for themselves over time, right? People would love lower cost and greener energy, but they can't pay to put those solar cells on their roof or the insulation in their attic. So that's the great, really laudable concept behind PACE. But what happened was that because environmental advocates were not in conversation with low-income consumer advocates, about how to design the program on the ground. Implementation matters, detail matters, regulatory control matters when you create a new program. They really missed the fact that having so few regulatory constraints so that a for-profit industry could just write all the rules was going to lead to fraud and abuse. And so sure enough, the PACE administrators created by law, the essentially private companies that run these programs, thought, well, we're not going to go door to door. We're going to just have these home contractors that have great neighborhood penetration and have all these great sales tactics press door to door for as many people as possible to sign up for these contracts. Well, as our report says, and we say it in a pointed footnote, home contractors are second only to auto salesmen as generators of consumer complaints about fraud and abuse. So it was obviously a recipe for disaster. And in the wings, as PACE started to deploy in the residential sector, people who represent low-income homeowners in fraud cases were saying, wait a minute, contractors are going to cause a problem. We can't have home contractors in charge of this. And nobody listened because that wasn't their issue space. And so over time, I began to understand that there was a real economic justice problem occurring with PACE. It still left me this question now that I'm in this new institutional setting of, well, why is an environmental clinic going to take this on, right? I mean, shouldn't a poverty clinic be taking that on? It matters, but that's not an environmental issue. But as we explored the issue, we began to realize that this economic justice travesty is intimately interwoven with an environmental performance failure, which is if contractors are doing unnecessary, crappy, cost-ineffective work, and often are not even finishing, or in some cases even starting the work that these low-income consumers have paid for, because there are no program quality controls in PACE before contractors get paid, that we're not getting any of these green benefits we're promised in the cases that involve fraud. We're not saying every case involves fraud, but where there's pervasive contractor fraud, we're also not getting green benefit. And so then I thought, well, this is really a place that our clinic can have an important role in bringing green energy proponents and proponents of energy efficiency into the same conversation as people who care about predation on low-income people. And that sort of leads to the report's recommendations.
Which is, my next question. What are the recommendations? What should change?
The recommendations map onto the report's three main findings. And so the first is that a foundational flaw of the PACE program is that there is no independent energy audit required of a home before home contractors can start suggesting all sorts of things to do to it. Some of these things are maybe put in incredibly expensive high-efficiency windows, even though the existing windows are not the main source of energy waste, and you would do much better just caulking a few leaks. It may be put these solar panels on your home, and the system they design is vastly oversized for the energy those home occupants even use, so it's just a massive price tag for no benefit. In many cases, contractors are saying that things can be financed with PACE, and accessory dwelling units, which are, the housing solution of the moment, are the case in point with massive current abuse. And that is incorrect. But what happens is because nobody is checking on what PACE contractors are installing before they are actually paid, homeowners get stuck with this enormous bill for something the program was never intended to cover, and that doesn't provide any energy benefit, and an ADU does not confer an energy benefit. And so we say you absolutely need independent third-party energy audits to identify what you should actually do to make your home more energy efficient and use cleaner power. And then on the back end, because there is so much poor and uncompleted and PACE ineligible contractor work, you need to have an inspection. That's the other piece of the sandwich. The contract works in the middle, but you need the audit at the beginning. That's one piece of bread. You need the inspection at the end. That's the rest of it, to make sure that this was actually a complete job, professionally performed. And then the final piece, which is not environmental but relates to economic justice, is at minimum you have to stop door-to-door sales. That is the sales vehicle of choice in low-income communities of color in California. It's caused enormous problems in LA County, which, as you probably know, has recently discontinued its PACE program. It's causing problems elsewhere in the state. And if this is a legitimate program that confers benefit, then it should be able to sell itself through a means other than pressure.
As you mentioned, Los Angeles has ended its PACE program, saying that it's just not something that they can support any longer because of the way that this program is being carried out. Should the program continue? Are the recommendations enough to stop all of the fraud that you've pointed out in this report?
You know, if we had robust audits and if we had real inspections and if we banned door-to-door sales, I honestly have a question whether, at least with respect to low-income consumers, which are our main concern, the economically vulnerable who could be put gravely in debt, who could potentially face foreclosure as a result of missed PACE payments, if all of the recommendations we make were put in place, I honestly don't believe it would be profitable for PACE administrators to market to low-income consumers. I think they would focus on the middle to high-end market, which is a much more appropriate place for financing as opposed to subsidy or outright grant. But that's an empirical experiment that will just unfold on its own. Our goal is not to take down the residential PACE program. Our goal is to make sure there are adequate consumer protections and that the promised green benefits are real.